Hello everyone. Today we got Diablo 4's quarterly update for December of 2021, and we got a lot of information to go over here, including itemization, a Paragon update, and visual effects in Diablo 4. Now I've already looked at all of this before making this video, and I've also looked at some of the other things people are saying about this update as well. And let's just say it seems like people are kind of upset with the direction of what's going on here. I feel like the game seems to be heading in a better direction than what we initially saw when they first revealed the game, but I do believe there's quite a bit more here that could be done to make the game more interesting, but I'll let you be the judge of that. So without further ado, let's just jump right in. First up, we have the itemization of Diablo 4. Plus the skill rank affixes are making a return, which for many Diablo 2 players, including myself, this is some pretty good news. In Diablo 4, the plus skill rank affix returns. As players invest points in skills, they grow in potency, and finding items with plus skill ranks can speed that along. As a bonus, when the player equips an item with plus skill rank for a skill they haven't learned, they will have access to that new ability. It's a great way to try out new skills before you're able to invest in them. Getting a lucky drop that nets you a skill you'd like for your build 10 levels before you would otherwise have access to it is a huge boost. I actually think that's pretty interesting. The fact that you can actually use the skill before you're of the level to be able to use it is kind of weird, but I'm interested to see how they would balance that. You would think that the item that had the plus to skill would inherently require you to be of the level of you being able to use that skill. So this is really an interesting twist on this concept. And here we have an image of a magic large axe with two affixes on it, one with a chance to slow and one with plus 4 ranks to the skill flay. Plus 4 ranks is quite a lot. In a game like Diablo 2, you would expect to see something like plus to 2 or plus to 3 skills, but plus to 4 or something was usually reserved for things like rune words. We'll have to wait and see just how many plus to skills you can get on your gear. But either way, I do think it's a nice addition. Something that I want to point out here that I haven't seen too many other people talk about is the damage per second stat and the damage per hit roll you can see on the item. Prior to this update, as far as I can remember and looking back at the other updates, items like weapons only had an attack stat that would say something like 850 weapon attack or 1305 weapon attack. And this was a pain point for a lot of different people. They would say things like the attack and defense stat were just really boring stats for itemization. And it looks like here that they've listened to that and tried to introduce something like this with the damage per second and the damage per hit ratios or rates on an item, as well as actually showing the attacks per second, like in this case this weapon is 0.90, whereas before all we got was very fast weapon or slow weapon. So in my eyes, this is definitely a step forward from the previous stats. But to be completely honest, is there really much of a difference? Yeah, we have damage numbers here and we can see the exact attacks per second, but is it really any different than slow weapon speed and weapon attack? So even after this post, a lot of people are still complaining about the itemization in Diablo 4. Even though I think a lot of people didn't notice this subtle change with the damage per second and the attacks per second, which I already said doesn't really seem to make too much of a difference anyway, at least not from the way that they worded and had the itemization looking before. I think what people are really complaining about is the fact that the weapons can't roll with things like increased physical damage or increased weapon damage, or like in Diablo 2, enhanced damage. And I think people would like to see things like that, especially on weapons rolling. So if you have a two-handed axe here and you have damage per second, well, maybe you want a two-handed axe to drop with a higher fizz damage, or maybe you want a fizz axe to roll with a bunch of lightning damage and elemental damage. Something that makes finding an item specific for your build more interesting. It also seems a little odd that maybe you would be a wizard or something using any type of weapon that's just damage per second and that scales your magic damage as well. Thematically, it just kind of doesn't make sense. What would be more interesting is to see something like a staff, even if it's the sorcerer specific staff, to have something like increased spell damage and just the base damage of it not really be relevant unless if you're using a skill for the sorcerer that scales off of that base weapon damage. It's stuff like that that I feel like makes items more interesting. Feel free to correct me if I'm wrong in the comments below, but we have more items to go over here and we'll talk more about the items as we go along. Next up, we have legendary and unique items. As Joe Shelley discussed back in our December 2020 update, legendary and unique items remain a core part of the Diablo item chase experience. We've made a foundational change to legendary items in Diablo 4 by allowing legendary powers to appear on multiple item slots. Now, if you're searching for a legendary power like martial arts, which enhances the barbarian's kick ability, you may find it on rings, chest plates, or helmets. There's no need to hunt for a specific item type any longer. I think this is really cool and interesting as long as the legendary powers are also interesting. If the legendary power is just 200 or 250% increased damage to some skill, then that's not very exciting or interesting in any way. But let's continue. Now the real question is, what happens when you find a power on an axe when you really wanted it on a ring? Or you found a great legendary amulet but can't use that power. Well, that is when we get to introduce our new friend, the Occultist. The Occultist can extract a legendary power from a legendary item, crystallizing it into an essence while destroying the item in the process. That essence can then be implanted into another legendary item, overriding the power that was present in the item at that time. Essence material can also be stored and used at a later time. Unique items cannot be modified in this way, keeping their fantasies intact and, as their name implies, unique. And here's an image showing how this would work. On the left-hand side, we have an axe with a legendary power. Fury skills deal 4% more damage for every second you haven't used a Fury skill, up to 24%. Barbarian only. And on the right hand side, we can see the essence with that legendary power. And it also lists the item types that you can put it on. And it's actually pretty interesting because it looks like you get a buff for putting it on an amulet and a damage buff for putting it on a two-handed weapon. So I think it kind of makes sense for you to get a power increase on a two-handed weapon with this legendary stat. It could make you actually think, well, maybe I want to put this on a two-handed weapon for this huge power increase. Or maybe there's another legendary power that might be more useful in your weapon slot. I do think it's a little strange that the amulet increases the damage though, because that might make you want to just put it in the amulet slot no matter what. Now, obviously, with the way this system works, we've discussed this before, but I think you're going to be wearing pretty much all legendary items with the one unique that your build might revolve around. I know people want rare items and magic items to be viable in this game, and they might find a way to make them viable, but I believe that most of your items, pretty much all of your items, are going to be legendary items once you get to end game. And that's just because of the way the system works. You take a rare item and you throw a legendary power on it, as we'll see here in a second, and you can have legendary powers on every single slot. Now, I don't necessarily think that's a bad thing because you could still be fishing for rare items with really, really good base stats, and then you just throw the legendary power on top of it. So in a way, it still makes rare items viable and chase items that you want to look at, but they're not going to be something you're going to be wearing just by themselves in an in-game setup. But basically what I wanted to say about the amulet is that the increased power here is probably just going to be something that you're going to have to think carefully about. So yeah, sure, while this particular essence gives you 33% increased power on an amulet, that probably applies to most other legendary powers you can put on an amulet. Because I don't know if you guys remember this before, back to the whole attack and defense stats that you can roll on items, but amulets were one of the items you could get the attack base mod on. So it seems like they wanted amulets to be more of an offensive item that you would think about considering for your character. And if we scroll down here, you can see that this rare amulet here doesn't have that base attack stat on it like they used to. So I think this is their way of still making amulets more of a power focused item rather than like a defensive or utility based item. And here, this is just another example of what I was basically saying before, and it just shows a base rare item with a bunch of rare stats, and then you throw the essence on it, turning it into a legendary item that carries that legendary unique stat from the essence onto the rare item with all the other base affixes that were already on it. So pretty much as I was saying before, rare items will be valuable, but only because you want to find a really good rare item to put a legendary stat on. Okay, let's continue. Hunting for items. Sanctuary is a vast world filled with the forlorn trails through werewolf-infested forests, withered heaths crawling with cannibals, and fog-choked graveyards crawling with the restless dead. There are plenty of enemies and monsters for the hero to encounter. Each of these monsters seem to enjoy collecting certain types of items and will be somewhat more likely to drop those items than others. While bandits are fond of maces, crossbows, and boots, if you're hunting for a new pair of pants, you do well to kill some of the drowned instead. I actually really love this idea, and I love the idea of being able to target farm items that you want specifically for your character. That way you just don't feel like you're mindlessly grinding through the game with no real way to obtain the things you're looking for. They go on to say that in past discussions, we've received feedback that it seems deflating for so much of a character's power to be delivered through the gear that they have equipped. Customizing and planning a character feels less rewarding if it doesn't play a big role in how the character performs in combat. We hear you loud and clear, and in Diablo 4 we have placed a stronger emphasis on character power that is earned by all the little decisions you make while leveling up and exploring the world of Sanctuary. While we aren't talking about everything we have planned for character power today, I'm happy to talk about one feature in particular, the Paragon Board. Okay, and before we jump into the Paragon Board, I want to say one last thing about items. Unique items aren't something they really talked about in this post, but in the post that they introduced them in, we really got to see how powerful they're going to be. But one thing that I'm not a huge fan of when it comes to these unique items is that they are going to be primarily class-specific items. And what scares me about class-specific items is that they're going to force you into these build path ideas, kind of like Diablo 3 set items, and I think makes the game a little less interesting. So for instance here, this Stormwalker's Cudgel makes it so that when Hurricane deals damage, there's a chance to automatically cast Tornado at the target for free. And this kind of guides the player's hand into how they should be building their character. And I'm not a giant fan of that. I think that when it comes to skills, the way that they function and work should be dealt with in like a skill tree, where you invest points into this skill tree system where, okay, well, if I want my Hurricane to randomly proc tornadoes, I can put skill points into my Hurricane to eventually unlock that skill. Last Epoch has a system very similar to this, but it gives the player the choice to pick and choose how they're going to build their character that way. And then you can have unique items that are more generic that make those decisions more exciting, in my opinion. So instead of this item being class specific and controlling the way your skills work, it just has a generic mod on there that can be used for multiple builds. And that's why I really like this kilt of the Plaguebringer here over on the left. It says your poisons no longer deal damage over time. Instead, 127% of the total damage is dealt to the target when your poisons expire. And if you look on the item, it's not specific to any one class. It looks like it can be used on any character. And items like this, I think, are what people really want in Diablo 4. They don't want to feel like the developers are telling them how to play the game. Okay, so let's jump into the Paragon Board, which is some of the more interesting stuff in this post. In Diablo 4, we have placed a heavy emphasis on build customization, ensuring that you can have plenty of control over how your hero grows. The Paragon Board unlocks for each class at level 50 and is a distillation of this focus. Your hero begins their journey through the Paragon system at the central starting tile of their class's intro board, and from there you make selections radiating outward. Once your hero reaches a gate tile, you choose which new Paragon Board you will like to attach to at that location. The desired outcome is a personalized set of bonuses that will empower your hero and honor your dedication to their progression that will remain fun to tweak and adjust over many playthroughs. There's a lot to take in the image below, so I'll walk through some aspects of what we're looking at here. So first off, I just want to say, if this Paragon system is infinite and not finite, then it's going to be fucking terrible. And anyone that thinks an infinite system is good is just wrong. I'm sorry, but you're wrong. Players don't want to feel like they have to run on a never-ending treadmill to progress their character. Even if it means that once you get to Paragon 4000, it's just so slow that it doesn't matter anymore, it's still annoying. And it's just poor game design, especially for games like ARPGs. Because when you have systems like this mixed in with systems that have never-ending dungeons, then your character is always going to feel like a pile of trash that is never actually doing damage or scaling well into the game. Because for me, and I think a lot of other ARPG players, you play these types of games to make your character stronger so that content that used to be hard for you is now something that you can very easily do, and you can farm things and it's more enjoyable. It's basically just being able to create a character that's a god, right? A character that can destroy enemies and never die. Like, that is the absolute appeal of ARPGs to me. And infinite systems, including infinite dungeons and infinite grinding systems like Paragons, completely negate that whole feeling and that whole process. Because no matter what you do, your character is always going to feel like they're just under that threshold of being able to efficiently do content. Just look at Diablo 3 and their rifts, for instance. Every time that you're pushing rifts, it's this slow crawl of just taking forever to kill these monsters, no matter how good your gear is or no matter what upgrade you just got before. It's like, oh, I can push one more rift, but it still feels just as slow as and painful as the very first rift that I did with terrible gear. You basically never get to feel like your character is any more powerful. It just all feels the same. And this is why endless systems are horrible ideas for ARPGs. Whatever, my rant is over now. Let's just get into the details of this system. The Paragon Board is comprised of many fixed tiles. As the barbarian earns experience, they will earn Paragon points, which are used to unlock a connected tile. There are a few varieties of tiles that I want to walk through. Normal tiles. These are straightforward, providing a small but meaningful stat boost. Normal tiles are connective tissues that can be found throughout the board and are quite common. Magic tiles are found in clusters throughout the board and provide a potent, more diverse set of benefits. As you might expect, they are less common than normal tiles, but are still plentiful. Rare tiles. Rare tiles offer significant boosts in power. Upon entering the Paragon Board for the first time, these represent great goals for players to chase, particularly once you've narrowed builds down towards highly specific goals. Rare tiles also have additional powers that unlock once the hero has raised an attribute to a sufficient level, requiring some choices to be made when plotting your path through the board. And lastly, we have legendary tiles. After the first Paragon board, each new board has a single legendary tile that can be found at its center. Legendary tiles impart a new legendary power to the character that earns it. And below there's an example of every single type of tile. First we have the common tile, which is just +5 strength. Then we have a magic one, which is 10% fire resistance. Then we have a rare one that gives you 10 fury per kill. And then if you have 175 strength and 125 willpower, you get 8% increased maximum fury. And then for the legendary one, it's just while your fury is above 50%, you deal 30% more damage. So I don't know if in this instance, when they say 30% more damage, if that's multiplicative and they're going to go with the Last Epoch and Path of Exile route of more being multiplicative and increase just being additive. But that's something we'll have to wait and see. It does kind of seem like that though, because we have seen instances of increased damage and some instances like this one here of more damage. I also just want to point out that this whole system just seems like Path of Exile's passive tree for the most part, where you have normal tiles that are just giving you some sort of main stat, and then magic tiles are kind of like the tiles leading up to notables in Path of Exile, and the notables being these rares here with you know, like increased fury or whatever, some other interesting stat. One thing that I'd really like to know about this system is whether or not these tiles are going to be random. Because just imagine if you had a build and you wanted to create a build guide for another player, and you were like, okay, well, once you got to the whole Paragon tree thing, you would have to just kind of wing it. It'd be kind of difficult to follow somebody else's build guide if these Paragon tiles were different every single time you played a character. Now, that's not necessarily a bad thing. I'm sure you could probably still do guides and be like, well, you just want to go for fury or increased damage on whirlwind or whatever. You just want to look for specific things in your tile sets, and it may not make that big of a difference. But as you can see here, and as you'll see in a second, some of the things you can get look like they're going to be increasing your damage substantially through this Paragon board system. Okay, on to the glyphs and sockets. A socket is a special tile that can contain a glyph. Glyphs are items found throughout Sanctuary that, when embedded into a Paragon board, confer various benefits based upon the number of active tiles within their radius. So basically just like jewel sockets in Path of Exile. Glyphs can also be leveled up by delving into some particularly dangerous dungeons. Leveling up a glyph extends the radius of their effect, allowing each one to draw power from or impart power to even more active tiles. I like this whole system. I think it's really interesting. And here we can see an example of just what they're talking about. So for the magic one, or for the magic level 3 one, the radius size is small and grants 30% bonus to all nodes within range. Then the level 8 one is a rare with a medium radius. And for every 10 dexterity purchased within range, you deal 13.5% increased damage to vulnerable targets. And it also grants 40.5% bonus to all nodes within range. And then for the level 15 one, the radius is large. And for every 10 willpower purchased within range, you deal 31.5% increased overpower damage. And it also grants 4 strength for each willpower purchased within range. Now this could end up being quite a lot of damage, which can be a little concerning at first glance. So if we scroll up and we look at this board here, and we think that, okay, this is a large circle, and every 2 points is 10 points. So we have 60. Right? And if I'm doing my math right, which I might not be, but I think I am, this would be 189% increased damage, which is quite a lot just for one glyph socket. But if we're comparing damage numbers or increased damage numbers to a game like Last Epoch, for instance, which I've been playing a lot of lately, I have a character on there that has and can have up to 640% increased physical damage, but my damage numbers aren't actually that high. And I think that's mostly to do with the fact that a lot of the base numbers start out pretty low. But you know, the overall damage and stuff isn't really all that big of a deal, as long as they just don't show us the damage numbers. But I think too many people would be upset if the damage numbers weren't in the game though. Alright, let's continue. Gate tiles and board selection. A single gate tile lies at each edge of the Paragon board. As you progress through the Paragon board, you will eventually reach a gate tile, which upon unlocking will allow you to select a new Paragon board to attach to your existing board. Each of these boards has unique tile layouts, new magic and rare tiles, and a new legendary tile at the center. So it says here that each of these boards has a unique tile layout. I'm not sure if that means that each board is just different from the last one, or if each time you play a character and go to your Paragon thing, it's just going to be different from the last time. And if that's the case, that could create some sort of problems, as I said before, for things like build guides and trying to replicate other players' builds. It's not necessarily a bad thing, but still something to consider nonetheless. The Paragon board is extended from these gate tiles. Upon selecting from the Paragon board list, you will be able to place the board down, connecting it to the newly unlocked gate tile. You may also optionally rotate the newly placed board. We're hard at work on these and other features that we'll be able to share more about in future updates. So for now, that's all from the systems team. Thanks for reading, and please share any feedback you have on social media, Reddit, or our forums. We'll see you in hell. So I have to say, a lot of this stuff is interesting, but I think there's still a lot that needs to be worked on here. And to be honest, it kind of feels like they just are ignoring people when they've been saying they really don't want infinite Paragon systems. People have been saying that since they initially announced this game. I mean, people have been saying that for years playing Diablo 3. And the itemization, while it does seem to be getting better, it doesn't really seem like they've hit the mark on that yet. So I encourage all of you to go to the forums and on social media and make posts giving your feedback on all this stuff. Just make sure you're not a dickhead about it, because no one listens to anyone that's a fucking asshole. Okay, this last section here is going over all the visual effects stuff in Diablo 4. This is actually really cool stuff, and this is the type of things that really separates Blizzard from a lot of other developers. So if you're into visual effects and the way the game looks, then this stuff should be really exciting for you too. I just want to say before we jump into this that there's going to be quite a bit of videos showing us new gameplay, new skills, new environments, and just the overall rhythm that we can expect from Diablo 4. First, they go over their visual effects philosophy. Every effect plays a role in the final composition of our game. It is important to understand the context of an effect and how it best serves your experience. One of our core values at Blizzard Entertainment is gameplay first, and this drives a lot of the artistic decisions we make while developing visual effects for the game. Moment-to-moment gameplay is the focal point within the composition of Diablo 4. It should draw your attention. To achieve this, we must consider things like player skills, monster telegraphs, traps, damage areas, and character states. The visual effects for each of these components must be readable in all areas and lighting conditions, so you can quickly understand what is happening and use that information to make informed decisions. In the chaos of combat, you'll need to be smart. Seeing a legendary item drop is exciting, but picking it up is not as important as reacting to a monster's attack that can one-shot hardcore characters. So Diablo 4 is going to have one-shots, so I like it. Our goal is to balance the primary, secondary, and tertiary reads to help you understand what is happening. To do this, we reserve visually loud effects for powerful skills like ultimate abilities, while weaker skills meld into the background. Each class has abilities that range from low to high in costs, cooldowns, and power. In tandem, classes have a range of visual intensity that increases with skill power. I just want to quickly point out here that they talk about skills with high costs and cooldowns and power, and specifically ultimate abilities. Now, I've talked about this quite a few times in a handful of my videos, but ultimate abilities are a horrible idea. And all we have to do is look at Diablo 3 for the perfect example of this. Diablo 3 has a lot of skills in the game that have long cooldowns with a bunch of damage, and then your entire character is basically focused around those skills, which yet again greatly reduces the overall choices players have on what skills they want to use. So basically, if you have a skill that does a lot of damage and it's on a long cooldown, well then you're going to be forced into trying to get a bunch of cooldown reduction so you can constantly spam that skill. And this was a big problem for itemization in Diablo 3, because you really felt like you needed to get CDR on every single item that you could get it on, as well as critical strike chance and critical strike damage, both of which are very boring stats in my opinion, especially in the way that they are created and implemented in Diablo 3, because basically every single character in the game wanted crit chance, crit damage, and CDR, which completely made most of the affixes on a good portion of items you could find very boring and uninteresting. So I know that this is probably something that's not going to change, but for the love of God, I really wish they would revisit this whole ultimate ability thing and the crit damage and crit chance stuff that they've been messing with for quite a while now. Let's continue to the combat improvements. To enhance the feel of combat, we have made several improvements to the way damage is applied to our game. In previous iterations of Diablo, an area of effect AoE or melee skill would be a single area of damage that is applied on a single frame. Thanks to our gameplay engineers, we can now animate target areas, what we call payloads, over multiple frames, which allows us to line up the animated target areas with the animated VFX that play out. Additionally, we have revamped the way we apply hit effects to monsters so impacts flow with the direction of a spell or melee attack. We use data defined in the animation and animated target area to find the most accurate place to hit a monster and where to apply a directional physics force to the ragdoll. In so few words, if you hit a goat man in the knee, the blood spray would come from his knee. The physics force applied to the goat man's knee would send it flying as if you kicked the legs out from under him. So something happened in this video that is really interesting. While the barbarian is whirlwinding through this pack of mobs, it looks like he reaches a rank for two-handed maces. And it looks like it increases the damage of overpower by 2%. Now, I don't know if this means that once you get to rank 2, it just keeps increasing the damage of overpower, or if you get to rank 2, it buff some other damage for another skill. But I thought this was really interesting. The fact that you could get to higher ranks for certain weapon types is like a very MMO type of thing, and I thought it was worth pointing out. Visual effects, casting and receiving light. In Diablo 4, we use a PBR, physically based rendering lighting model, which means our materials look and react to light in a realistic way. Same thing that they use in Diablo 2 Resurrected. This approach brings huge rendering improvements, but this can be counterintuitive to what a player might expect for class and monster abilities. As an example, think about what a campfire looks like in full daylight. Pretty lackluster, right? Next, imagine what a dust cloud or smoke plume would look like in the dead of night. It'd be nearly impossible to see. To account for this, we've built an engine and shader library that lets us break PBR rule sets in artistic ways. This ensures important gameplay moments shine through as clearly as possible while keeping immersive elements full PBR so they can realistically react to lighting. Previous iterations of Diablo use primarily unlit particles, meaning they are not affected by the environment's lighting. These particles give you amazing control over what the art will look like. What you paint is what you get. The downside to unlit particles is that art may look too bright in a dark dungeon, or VFX color schemes may not feel cohesive within every environment. In Diablo 4, we use lit VFX that meld into the environment's lighting, creating a more immersive experience. Using Whirlwind as an example, seen in the above video, in bright daylight, the blade reflects light from the sun. In a dark dungeon, it will reflect more subtle light sources like torches. The dust kicked up by the skill is also lit by the environment, so it blends artfully into the world. If we rely solely on environment lighting and follow true PBR rules, then gameplay readability is muddied, particularly in dark environments where a weapon swing would naturally be hard to see. To counteract this, many VFX have emissivity to cast light onto the environment. Several ultimates in our game will even allow you to change the weather and lighting of the environment for a limited duration. We strive for a healthy balance of gameplay clarity and thematic immersion. Obviously, all this lighting stuff looks great. I wouldn't expect anything less from Blizzard. Dynamic player skills. At the end of the day, it doesn't matter what the art looks like if the gameplay isn't fun. One of the goals for creating player skills is to ensure that the system design team has a variety of modifiers they can utilize to create meaningful skill trees, class mechanics, legendary items, and Paragon boards. Choices should affect more than your character's stats. Once we have a class skill we are happy with, the VFX team adds the ability for developers to dynamically change the size, intensity, and duration of a skill. The visual intensity of a skill will increase as you stack upgrades and items that increase the power of that ability. In addition to these skill modifiers, we create variants of abilities that completely change the functionality of a skill or the damage type that it deals. These skill variants can be changed by the scale, intensity, and duration modifiers as well. This allows variants of skills to be affected by a wider range of legendary modifier groupings. Your skill tree, Paragon decisions, along with the items you have equipped, will make your character look and play differently from other characters of the same class. Each of these ranges is handcrafted by an artist to ensure that the art holds up at all supported sizes and intensities. We do not uniformly scale every piece of an effect when changing size and intensity. We modify things like spawn rate, velocity, emissivity, and other color ranges to make certain that art still fits in the world of Diablo. This is something that I've really wanted in ARPGs for quite a while. This idea that the more powerful you get with skills, or like the more cold damage or fire damage you're doing, or things that you add in, change the way the skill looks. I would love to see that if you have poison damage and fire damage on your gear, that you get like some green and red mixed in with whatever skills you're using. Or maybe if you change the type of damage a skill does from fire to cold, for instance. So instead of it having the obvious red and orange flames of a fire skill, it goes to the icy blue of a cold skill instead. We want your character to look incredible as well. Our items are built in a way that allows us to easily apply weapon buffs to any weapon in the game. Not only will your legendary items do awesome things, but they will make your character look amazing as well. Here's an example where we apply the same fire and poison buff to several weapons in our game. I mean, I really like all the weapon effect stuff. I was expecting by the description they gave that they would look really different on different weapon types, but you know, it looks about the same on every weapon, but it's still cool. Skill driven deaths. Sanctuary is a dark gothic world filled with horrific monsters that do horrendous things. To survive in this bleak landscape, you must be merciless towards your enemies. We are bringing back a popular feature from Diablo 3, skill-driven deaths. This system allows you to decapitate, bisect, freeze, shatter, eviscerate, and burn your enemies, to give a few examples. I'm a big fan of over-the-top violence. I've been a giant fan of Mortal Kombat for years, so I'm definitely not opposed to this.
Cyrax wins. Brutality.
With our new PBR pipeline, we can make blood, viscera, and gore even more realistic by having it react properly to the lighting of an environment. Every monster is built with a skeletal and muscular structure used for killing them in brutal ways. If your character is in the thick of combat, they will be covered in the blood spatter of nearby monsters. Over time, your character's armor will transition back to being spotless. I have to be honest, the blood spatter on the druid doesn't really seem like as interesting as they described it. It just sort of seems like they throw a bunch of decals on you once you've smacked an enemy a few times, because even if you look, he's got blood all over his back and his back wasn't even facing the enemy at any point. But I don't think this really matters that much because it's an isometric game and you're not going to be zoomed in on your character all the time. The sorceress studies the art of elemental magic. They slow enemies with cold before freezing them solid and shattering them to pieces. They strike their enemies with stunning bursts of lightning, causing bodies to pop and sizzle. Enemies collapse to the floor and char to the bone as the sorceress engulfs foes in fire. And here are some examples of the death types that the sorcerers can trigger. Freeze/shatter, break frozen monsters into pieces. Char, which singes the corpse of a monster with lightning. Burn, scorch the monster's flesh, leaving the remains of a charred skeleton. Then we have the barbarian that takes pride in their physical capabilities. Their arsenal of weaponry makes them deadly in close combat. With the power of their ancient bloodline, barbarians crush foes into piles of gore or send them flying across the battlefield. Their brute strength is equally matched by their speed and ferocity as they unleash fury on the battlefield, dismembering limbs from all that stand in their way. And then some of their death triggers are Crush, which flatten a monster under the weight of a heavy object. Decapitate, remove a monster's head from its body. Cut in half, which is sweet. Break lower limbs. The monster's lower body is shattered, splitting several of their joints. The rogue is dexterous. Their attacks are methodical. Monsters are often oblivious to their presence until it is far too late. A precise stab from one of their daggers or a well-placed arrow is enough to bring more monsters to the floor. The rogue finds the most opportune time to take on a fight, and they imbue weapons to gain an advantage. Shadow magic can make a superb distraction, but their shadow clones are as deadly as their blades. Some examples of death types that rogues can trigger. Eviscerate, spill the insides of a monster. Shadow energy deteriorates the life from a monster's flesh. Freeze/shatter, break frozen monsters into pieces. Poison, the monster's skin melts off, leaving a heap of muscle and bone. Flay the skin from an enemy, leaving the muscle structure intact. And lastly, we have the druid. The druid is one with nature magic. It conjures storms and call down lightning on their enemies. They control the battlefield with gusts of wind as their animal companions tear the flesh from monsters. Druids manipulate the earth with nature magic, molding it to their will and bludgeoning enemies from afar. As their enemies approach, they see the innate power of the druid shapeshifting fluidly between an agile werewolf and a hulking werebear. Some examples of death types that druids can trigger: Roadkill, the monster is crushed by a moving object, leaving a smear of blood on the ground. Devoured, the monster's flesh is eaten away by a swarm of ferocious bites. Lightning Gib, the lightning causes the monster's body to pop, exploding into pieces. I'm sure that's pretty fun. And Maul, the monster's skin is completely mangled, covering them in blood. And that's it for this whole quarterly update. I have to say that this last little bit of gameplay footage they gave us here is actually really interesting and pretty telling on the type of direction that they're going for in the game. If you pay attention to a lot of the fights and encounters in this video, you'll see that it looks like the game is actually going to be pretty slow. And I'm a big fan of that, but it could also be that most of these characters they're showing are lower levels and they're just using a lot of the basic skills. As a matter of fact, if you look at the rogue gameplay footage, I think that's more of a representation of what we can expect from end-game gameplay, which is where she's dashing around and one or two shotting a lot of the monsters. Another thing here that's worth mentioning are the damage numbers, and that's something that I think a lot of people are going to get hung up on. I believe that the damage numbers are fine if they just don't show them to us. Yes, I'm sure there's going to be an option where we can turn them off, but if we can have them on or off, most people will probably opt into turning them on. And if they're going to be on, then they should probably figure out a way to lower the damage numbers significantly, because seeing numbers for things like in the millions or billions kind of just makes it really uninteresting and really just fills the screen with a bunch of clutter and ugliness. Because just imagine Path of Exile, for instance. Path of Exile has huge damage numbers in the millions. But we just don't see it because we don't have an option to see it. And I think that's the way to go. I think they should just not give us the option and turn damage numbers off. Let us feel the damage. We don't need to see it. But that's my last little bit of 2 cents. Don't forget to go to the forums like Reddit and on social media to share your thoughts on the quarterly update and what you think that they should do to make Diablo 4 better. And like I said before, be respectful because nobody's going to listen to you if you're acting like a dickhead. But yeah, guys, thanks for watching, and don't forget to subscribe for more Diablo 4 related content.